Pleased to see you all here and to meet the people online and the future people on YouTube as well. We come now to session 4. But before I begin, I would like to say that after last session, when I was talking about the birth stories, I guessed there'd be some questions, but I didn't get any. But Tom said to me later, people wished they could have asked questions, so please talk to me afterwards or email me at my home address. The email, all lowercase, is Barbara, wh@virginmedia.com. But now for tonight. We come to session 4, and a very important session it is too. We finished last time with the first of the so-called plagues, and I suggested you might like to check how many you could find in the book of Exodus. If you did, you read of the river turning red and therefore undrinkable, frogs, gnats, flies, a deadly pestilence amongst livestock, an outbreak of boils among humans and animals, a hailstorm that flattened the barley and the flax crops, locusts, 3 days of darkness, and the last, the death of the firstborn sons in each Egyptian family, 10 in all. It all sounds rather gruesome, doesn't it? So what can we make of all this? Well, many people think that the whole sequence suggests a year of natural disasters, following an exceptionally large annual flood of the River Nile, which was this particular year so overwhelming that it swept down much more red clay than usual from Upper Egypt. And for many centuries, of course, it was this annual flood which made Egypt so fertile. And only in the 1960s did it change when Colonel Nasser ordered the building of the Aswan Dam. Another theory suggested is that the sequence of disasters was part of the after effects of a volcanic eruption somewhere among the islands of the Aegean Sea. Other people wonder why there were 10 such disasters. And others ask why were the Israelite families seemingly unaffected by them? Well, whatever answers we try to find, we are really missing the whole point of the storytellers. They are building up to the wow factor for the most important stories which are going to follow and which still command our attention today. But back to the plagues. First, there is no mention at all of plagues in the Old Testament, only signs and wonders, which definitely consign them to sacred history, rather than reality as we know it. That doesn't mean that nothing happened, only that even in God's story, he can only act within human history of space and time. Secondly, why 10? Now, this is the trick of the trade of pre-literate communities when they wanted to remember a lot of items and make sure they didn't forget one. They count 1 for each finger, and then they're sure they haven't forgotten one. Then thirdly, it looks as if there might have been less than 10 signs. There are 2 other accounts of these disasters in the Old Testament, and both of them in the book of Psalms. Now, Psalms are poetry, and poems which were sung to a regular meter helped to preserve the originals from exaggeration by successive storytellers. The older psalm, number 78, lists only 8 disasters, 8 signs of Yahweh's power. And it comes from the oldest strand of literature, that J code that I've mentioned so often, while the other, in Psalm 105, comes from the later priestly writings and glories in the exaggerations which have been added on later. One more question. Why were the Israelites seemingly exempt from the disasters? Ordinary history will be looking for genetic differences between 2 or more different races. But we are in sacred history, so don't worry. The storytellers are steadily and persistently building up and building up and building up the big climax of Yahweh's power and concern for his chosen people. Each disaster is punctuated in turn with a chorus. Would Pharaoh give in to this demand from an unknown God? And the answer, time after time, was no. 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 And the duel between the gods of Egypt, embedded in the authority of the Pharaoh, and the God Yahweh and his servant Moses was intense, and it culminated in the last struggle of all. So the scene is set. We are ready for the 4 most important stories in the whole of the Jewish scriptures: the Passover, the Exodus, the making of the covenant, and the giving of the law. All 4 are the foundations of the Jewish faith. So we turn to the Passover Festival. For Jews today, it's as important as Christmas is for Christians. Just look at the happy scene round the table. Families gather in large numbers and have symbols of a desert meal on the Seder plate. Like that. You recognize the unleavened bread, I'm sure, and the cup of wine, the egg, the bitter herbs, and the lamb shank, and various other things. There is a lot of laughter and fun, even for the children, a treasure hunt for the children, and 4 cups of wine to be enjoyed while the children are taught the story of the festival. There they are, look, 2 little boys with their skull caps on, learning and remembering. The story, with all its exaggerations and children's questions for use during the meal, are enshrined in a book of liturgy called the Haggadah. Looking like that. We would pick up a book of the parish Eucharist. They pick up the book of the Haggadah for the Passover meal. It's not strictly the story from the scriptures, any more than our Christian nativity plays are strictly from the Gospels. And the liturgy includes prayers, as well as times for eating, and don't forget the drinking of 4 cups of wine. And there's the family again, enjoying themselves. And you can see them all with their Haggadahs in front of them, following the liturgy as it proceeds. All these detailed instructions for the festival in Exodus, of course, have been written into the scriptures at a much later time. But if you ever get the invitation to join a Jewish family's Passover meal, do accept it and thoroughly enjoy it. It really is a very happy evening. Originally, a long time ago, the Passover was the ancient spring festival when shepherds celebrated the birth of the new season's lambs. But later, when the Israelites had settled in Canaan and become farmers, the Shepherds' Festival was combined with the ancient Farmers' Festival of unleavened bread. celebrating the beginning of the barley harvest, when the first loaf was offered without any time being wasted on leavening it with yeast. So we have Passover and unleavened bread. But originally, they were quite separate. But since those days, they've both been combined into the story we have in Exodus, when the lamb was killed and blood smeared on the door of each home, then cooked and eaten hurriedly with unleavened bread, while everyone was dressed and ready to take off on a long journey. And again, there are two versions of all this, saying much the same as each other, but differing in detail. One suggests that the getaway was started in secret during the night of the tragic deaths of the Egyptian children, while the other says that next day, the bereaved Egyptians in their distress begged them to go and gave them all sorts of inducements to help them on their way. The result was that the motley crowd of brickworkers, a few Israelites and others, did make their escape away from Egypt and towards the land of Midian in Sinai. They avoided the coastal route because that was endangered by some Philistines who were beginning to arrive from the west. So they headed southwards down towards Midian. Well, the crossing of the Red Sea and the deliverance from the danger of pursuing Egyptians in their chariots is the supreme foundation story. Not only for Jews, but also for Christians when you think of Good Friday. The message is the same for both groups. God is the deliverer from all the powers of evil. The story is told in the book of Exodus with all the exuberance of many excited songwriters and storytellers whose exaggerations have all been piled on top of each other. It begins with the journey away from Egypt led by fire, a pillar of fire by night, and a pillar of cloud by day, into the unfamiliar and very unwelcoming desert wilderness. It wasn't long, as you can see from the picture, before they were suddenly overwhelmed with fear. They became aware of the Egyptian force of armed soldiers. Here's the first, very dramatic, from the walls of the tombs of the pharaohs. There's another one, more fierce. And as for this one, you can imagine the fear of people being chased. Catching up with them from Egypt, and it seemed that they were doomed. Would they all be killed, or would they be captured and returned to brickmaking in Egypt? No doubt, with a harsh penalty for escaping. They were scared. And I have to remind you, there is no corroborating evidence for the story in any Egyptian writings that have been found so far. So the Egyptian force was certainly not led by the pharaoh. Maybe any records that did exist have been lost in the mud of the River Nile Delta. Or more likely, perhaps it was only a small detachment of chariot soldiers under their own unit commander, whose eventual failure was preferably and conveniently forgotten, and certainly not written into their usual official accounts of success. But let's enjoy the story embedded in Exodus 14. Their fear grew alarmingly when the escaping Israelites realized they were not only in danger from the Egyptians chasing them from behind, but also when they found themselves faced with a large sea of water ahead. They were trapped. Traditionally, it was called the Red Sea, but it's more likely to have been a sea of reeds. in the low-lying area which is now part of the Suez Canal. Their fear made them grumble all the more with Moses, wishing they'd taken no notice of him when he first invited them to obey a new God and escape with him. And once more, my study Bible over there shows the intertwining of 3 different accounts of what happened. The second and the third layers, of course, turning the original account into an almost unbelievable miracle, which has echoes in many of the poems of the Old Testament. The oldest layer of the story is in the J code. Do you remember? In the south near Jerusalem, named after Yahweh, which tells us that during the night, nothing could happen because Yahweh's cloud successfully hid the Israelite people from the Egyptians. And in the next morning, a strong east wind had blown the shallow waters and made the sea like dry land. Then the second one comes in from the E code, which tells of God. That tells us that the angel of God manipulated the cloud which had caused the delay. And thirdly, the priestly code triumphantly says that Moses stretched out his hand over the sea and the waters were divided. So the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry land, and that the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left. Wow. But all the Egyptians pursued and followed, all the horses, the chariots, and the horsemen. Then back to the oldest story, Yahweh saw that the Egyptians' chariot wheels were getting stuck, and panic was settling in. Then in the third priestly code again, Moses again stretched out his hand, and the waters fell in on the Egyptian horsemen, who were all drowned. But the Israelites were still on dry land, between the 2 walls of water. And then the J code again. In the morning, the strong east wind had dropped. And when the Israelites saw all the dead bodies of the Egyptians behind them, and here we reach the climax of the story, the people feared Yahweh. And they believed in his mighty power and in his servant Moses. And for a short while, the grumbles stopped. They were free. Free at last. Free from fear of Egypt. The first 18 verses of chapter 15 is a lengthy hymn of praise for Yahweh. It's known as the Song of the Sea. It's been inserted there, and our story doesn't continue until verse 19, with a happy repetition of the miracle, the dead Egyptians and Israelites walking on dry land, and then, most excitingly for us, the E code tells of the story of the Israelite women. Led by Moses' sister Miriam, dancing and singing with their tambourines on the far side of the water. And the tiny poem, the so-called Song of Miriam, in verse 22, is thought to be vividly contemporary with the event. And this is remarkable, isn't it? First time we have something that might be contemporary with the event that's happened. So historically, possibly the oldest poem in the whole of the Old Testament. So what did Miriam sing? Sing to Yahweh, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. Sing to Yahweh, for He has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. They were free. And that will surely be good forevermore. Well, we have to conclude that without any records to help us, that something did happen. Because the deliverance from the Egyptian chariots became so deeply ingrained in the minds of the people who escaped that it was never forgotten. And the memory became the foundation event for all that happened in the many years that to come. And when Israel's faith went through times of weakness and apostasy, it was the Mosaic prophetic strain in the Old Testament that revived it. No tenses in ancient Hebrew, remember? So what happened then is still happening today. No past, no future, everything in the present. When you think of the Christian Eucharistic prayers of the Last Supper, you've got the same idea creeping in. What happened at the Last Supper is happening here, 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning. It took 3 months before the travellers all arrived back to Jethro's encampment. There's a Bedouin encampment. See the tent and the animals outside. Several tents side by side. Not much of a front garden. Not much of a back garden either. Bit rough. But during that time, when memories of their escape were overtaken again by the hardships of life in the desert, they thought back to the plentiful food and drink and all the lovely fruits they used to have in Egypt, and they began to grumble again, a lot. They grumbled at Moses day after day. But remember, he had been educated as a boy in Egypt to be a leader. And he had also learned about life in the wilderness from his father-in-law, Jethro. So he was able to teach the people how to collect sweet manna each morning for bread, how to catch exhausted quails at night for meat, and how to find water near the surface level in some of the rocks. And when they won a skirmish against the leadership of young Joshua against a group of warring Amalekites, they no doubt began to feel a little encouraged in surviving the difficulties. The grumblings did not stop, however, as they continually looked back to the security of life in Egypt and compare it with their new, uncomfortable, unpredictable, uncertain life in the wilderness. But at last, they arrived at Jethro's encampment. Moses was reunited with his family, and a large family celebration followed, in which Aaron was invited to join. The next day, however, Jethro watched Moses, coping all day long with all the troubles of the travellers, and he advised him to organise the people into more formal groups, each with their own leaders, who would deal with the small matters, leaving Moses more time for his family and also for coping with the more important issues which mattered for the whole group. And so the political tribal system came into being, which lasted for many years of Israel's life in Canaan. It was created in the wilderness and originally from the motley group of slave workers, including some Israelites, whose only common desire was to escape from slavery. They were grouped into groups of 12. They made 12 groups, and each group took a name from the sons of Jacob, one of Moses' ancestors. who had taken them to Egypt many years beforehand. The travellers, like Moses before them, were full of awe when confronted by the holy mountain. Moses had climbed there in the sunshine. It was huge and even awesome when the weather deteriorated. It could be very frightening at times, as many climbers, of course, describe today. And even those who climb the extraordinary Glastonbury Tour in Somerset, who report that there's always wind swirling around at the top, even on the calmest of sunny days. Then the biblical description of fire, lightning, thunder, earthquakes at the holy mountain in Exodus is so vivid that made travellers in our 19th century go looking for a volcano in their efforts to prove that the Bible was true, and then doubting the whole story when they found no volcanoes anywhere in the Sinai Peninsula. But Sinai was, and still is, what we call a thin place on earth, where there seems to be an unusual closeness between the ordinary and the extraordinary experiences which can happen there. Like Iona, or Holy Island here in Britain, and there are others too. In this course, of course, you're being persuaded to call such experiences a theophany. So what happened to these people? The fire, lightning, and thunder reminded them of all that Yahweh had done for them and filled them with awe and a different type of fear, a holy fear, which made them shiver. It was now that the law was given, and the covenant established, which bound all the people together as the people of Yahweh, the God of the mountain, who had rescued them from slavery, as they now spoke of their time in Egypt. And once again, we're faced with a simple event which turns out to be a complex phenomenon. But let's first enjoy the story. After all, it was the story that was remembered and told and is still retold and was so very important in a pre-literary society. So we come to Exodus chapter 19. The travellers pitched camp on the foothills of Sinai, and Moses left them there to climb up into the clouds to meet Yahweh. When, after a long time, 40 days as they always describe it in the Bible, he returned, he told of his meeting with Yahweh, who had offered to make a covenant between himself, their rescuer, and themselves. It would be different from the covenant that Yahweh had made with Abraham. That had been a free gift, a promise of land and many descendants for the future. This covenant would not be a promise, it would be conditional, a sort of tit-for-tat arrangement. I will do this for you, providing you will do that for me. And it would be ratified freely by both sides. When Moses put this to the people, that Yahweh offered to be their God forever, protecting them through thick and thin, but only on the condition that they would promise to keep his law, the people asked, what is his law? And the answer was short, sharp, and to the point. I am Yahweh, your God. You shall have no other gods except me. And he added and you shan't make any image or idol of me and worship it. The story doesn't continue until chapter 24, after the supreme law had been extended to 10, possibly by Moses himself, who had studied Egyptian law, remember, when he was a boy. The people agreed, and they prepared for an important covenant ceremony to take place at which the covenant would be ratified. This system, of course, prevails even today in political history. You think of all the meetings between governments, making agreements and then having a meal to celebrate. It's just the same system. And this one at Sinai was no exception, being of supreme importance. So when Moses, Aaron, and all the leaders of the new tribal groups approached the mountain, Moses again laid out the conditions of Yahweh's offer, and they all freely replied, "All the words which Yahweh has spoken, we will do." And the big celebration began. An animal was chosen, an altar was erected, with fire, symbolizing the presence of Yahweh, fire placed on its top. The people again heard the conditions that were offered and solemnly agreed to them. And when all was ready, the animal was killed, and its blood, signifying the whole of its life, was collected in 2 different bowls, one of which was thrown onto Yahweh in the fire, and the other bowl of blood sprinkled all over the people, thus uniting them all into one living bond forevermore. And then they all enjoyed the feast in the presence of each other. Now, this covenant language appears many times throughout the Bible and is repeated, as Christians know, in the making of the new covenant at the Last Supper, before the ultimate life of Jesus was killed on Good Friday. Just the same sort of idea. But from now on, Israel will be Yahweh's own special possession. And throughout their history, they have had to learn, with the help of the prophets, that with such a privilege comes responsibilities, as well as the perks, and that Yahweh's law is supreme in their lives for them and for all future generations. Well, when we consider the law of Yahweh, do remember there are no tenses in their verbs. Everything is present here and now. So the later Israelites could never say, "It was our ancestors who made this promise, not us." It doesn't apply to us, they tried to say, but it did. It did apply, always in the present tense, as if they had personally agreed to it themselves. And every year, until they became a literate society, it was customary for all the tribes to meet together, as Bedouins do to this day, to have a joyful covenant festival, usually at one of the boundary edges, at which the children were taught how far they could go. They were taught who they were and told the stories of their ancestors, while their elders were reminded of their covenant with Yahweh that bound them together as a community, as well as other matters, of course. Territorial boundaries were remembered, marriages were arranged, and of camel races held, and dancing, song, and plenty of music, of course. The boundaries, these covenant ceremonies, just left no excuse for not knowing what mattered. The one law, though, "I am Yahweh, you shall have no other gods but me," had become 10, one for each finger, of course. The 10 are all simple and direct, known as didactic law. But in applying them, many questions demanded clarification, and gradually case law were developed to help the elders to administer their judgments, especially when the tribes had settled in Canaan and become farmers and landowners. In time, all these laws, the 10 plus the case laws, were collected and codified, but still ascribed to Moses. So Moses was always to be the supreme lawgiver, until finally they were all placed alongside the story of Moses at Mount Sinai, taking up the rest of the book of Exodus, the whole of the book of Leviticus, and the first 9 chapters of Numbers, thereby creating a very long gap in our story. Then years later, when the book of Deuteronomy was discovered, that was also included, giving Jews their first 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those 5 books are known as the complete Torah, the law of Yahweh. This is so special for Jews that they always wrap scrolls of the law in elaborate covers and keep them in an ark, which is a cupboard in the synagogue. A synagogue service on the Sabbath day always begins with a procession of the Torah scroll. Can you see the lad struggling with it? It was not something small to carry. It's something he had to carry with difficulty but with great care. And the synagogue service always starts with the scrolls being carried from the ark to the reading desk. And when it gets to the reading desk, it's there for the service, and there it is, unwrapped, unrolled, and it's unrolled from both sides. And can you just see the narrow columns of the scroll? It was so that not too much of it had to be unrolled at any one time, then to be able to read the story. So that's the reading from the story today in any synagogue throughout the world. Now, when the original covenant ceremony was concluded, the travellers began on their journey again. You can't have a high mountain experience such as they had lived through without coming down with a bump. So don't hope for such an exciting session next time. But next time we shall meet at 4:30 on the 5th of December, and it's entitled On from Sinai for a Long Time, the traditional 40 years. Well, thank you for coming. I'm going to be here, and you can ask any questions you like. But if you are interested, if any of you are interested to read about this in a more scholarly way, the best, easy-to-read scholarly book of all this I've got put on the table, and I advise you, if you want it, to get on the internet and try and get a copy. I'm sure it's out of print by now. But it's known as The Living World of the Old Testament. It's not too bogged down with technical details, but you've got the story as the scholars have found it for you. It's there, and when I had a previous group of students, they all turned up the next week with copies that they'd managed to get for a very modest amount of money, sometimes only £8 or £9. So there's hope for everybody. Anyway, there's my copy on the table, and I recommend it to anybody else who's interested to read more seriously. Well, thank you for coming, and I'll see you next time.